We'll call the committee hearing to order. Good afternoon and welcome to today's hearing on how the innovation economy leads to growth. The U.S. economy is not only growing, but it's also doing it faster. GDP growth is rising, job creation is strong, average wage growth is improving, and inflation remains low. These long-awaited positive results stem from the decision to unleash America's most valuable economic asset, the American people. Tax and regulatory relief are allowing American families and Main Street job creators more breathing room and to do more. Contrary to those who believe that we were stuck at low growth, many economists expect as much as 3% GDP growth in 2018 and similar strong growth in 2019. And to achieve this, Washington needs to stay out of the way so that individuals are free to figure out new ways to solve old problems. Such innovation is vital to sustaining our restored economic growth. America has been a laboratory for invention since its inception, and it is that spirit that has led to our strength. A report by McKinsey Global Institute in March of 2017, last year, finds that many advanced economies rely on productivity gains far more than increases in the labor supply to drive economic growth. Folks in the private sector know this when they ask questions like, how can we serve more customers in one day? How can we complete more orders in less time? How can I produce a product with fewer passes of a machine? Those questions are how innovation becomes the primary driver of productivity gains. And we know we are blessed to live in the United States for a variety of reasons, but among those blessings are our fellow Americans who have generated remarkable technologies to lift our standard of living, to expand our horizons, to support U.S. leadership in the world, and to grow our economy. Not all economic systems are equally conducive to such path-breaking innovations. Every technological advancement of major economic consequence since World War II has come from the United States, and that's no accident. As we will hear from our witnesses today, strong property rights, the rule of law, light regulation, and competition are critical conditions for visionary entrepreneurs and risk takers and dreamers and investors and creators to generate the technological success that we have seen. American inventors and Main Street job creators and the resourceful factory workers will continue to deliver amazing advances, but that's contingent on Washington allowing that to happen. A brilliant idea or discovery is only the start. It has to be put into concrete form and developed. And from there, it has to be commercialized and disseminated throughout the economy before it actually boosts economic growth. These steps can take a long time, depending on how they are taxed and regulated, or how antitrust law is applied. The highway to innovation is littered with potholes, traffic jams, and overturned vehicles. You can see this up close in my home state of Minnesota, where an excise tax has threatened the innovative medical device industry and could drive it away to other countries. While the federal government has temporarily suspended this tax, innovators still face great uncertainty about their future. Even more obstacles lurk along the path of international trade. Last year, this committee held a hearing on digital trade, and the takeaway is that the United States leads in digital products and trade that rely on the internet. Yet the freedom of the internet faces challenges abroad, and the United States must strive to protect it. To remain credible in this mission, the United States must generally promote and defend the long-held American principles of unencumbered international transactions and trade. Every day has the potential for game-changing technological breakthroughs. Blockchain is an example of a technology at an early stage of development. Its potential for very wide application throughout the economy could be stifled by overregulation. And the United States has the opportunity to continue to be the champion of its age of invention, but only if we keep the engines of innovation running. We must protect the ability of our market economy to perform at its full potential at home and in global markets across the world. I look forward to the testimony from our distinguished panel of witnesses today for clarity and for guidance on how innovation can drive economic growth and American prosperity. Before I introduce our witnesses, though, I'd like to now recognize our ranking member, Senator Heinrich, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Paulsen, for calling today's hearing on promoting innovation and accelerating economic growth. Innovation drives economic growth and boosts wages. We need more of it, and we need innovation to be more broadly shared across regions. Other countries are moving forward aggressively to promote innovation, to support advanced manufacturing, and to boost the productivity of their workforces. To lead in the 21st century, the United States must remain at the forefront of game-changing discoveries and create an ecosystem that supports innovation across the economy. The federal government plays a key role in this, funding and conducting research and development, investing in human capital of our people, and ensuring that we are making the necessary investments in a STEM workforce. STEM education and R&D are two innovation anchors. We need to ensure that students everywhere have access to STEM pathways, and that starts with making sure that schools have the resources they need to recruit, train, and retain talented science and math teachers. We need to expand middle skills pathways into emerging sectors and make a college education accessible and affordable for all Americans, so that every student has the opportunity to benefit from tomorrow's innovations. The federal government remains the largest funder of basic research. That research, which adds to our fundamental stock of knowledge, yet often would not be conducted without public investment. This is the research that can help us solve the problems we don't yet know we even have. Basic research has driven major leaps forward, including mapping of the human genome, vaccines, breakthroughs in cancer research, and energy storage technology, and the creation of the Internet, laser, MRI, and GPS. The knowledge gained through this research has significant spillover economic benefits, increasing productivity, creating jobs, and accelerating economic growth. That's why it's encouraging that the recent omnibus agreement made significant investments in R&D. Investments in basic research increased by almost 10% over the previous year, its largest annual increase since the Recovery Act in 2009. Promoting innovation also means extending already developed technologies like broadband to communities currently without access. Today, years after high-speed internet was first made available, 19 million rural Americans still lack access. The private sector doesn't have the incentive to extend broadband to remote, hard-to-reach communities. The federal government must step in and fill that gap. We also need smart policies that can help emerging industries grow. Targeted tax credits, competitive grants, and prize competitions are all levers that Congress can pull. The multi-year extension of the wind production tax credit is a good example. It is driving investment in wind farms in New Mexico and across the country. Earlier this year, I toured the future site of the $1.6 billion Sagamore Wind Project in eastern New Mexico, which will be the largest wind production farm in our state's history and create up to 300 construction jobs and 30 full-time operations jobs. Programs like Laboratory-Directed Research and Development, LDRD, authorizing a portion of federal labs funding for cutting-edge R&D are also quite vital. At Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico, LDRD researchers generally account for 1/4 of the lab's patents and peer-reviewed publications. Efforts to help commercialize technology developed at our national labs and research universities help to take a good idea and get it into production and out into the marketplace. In New Mexico, we've seen how commercializing the R&D that takes place in our labs can generate significant economic opportunities. I'll share just one example. Descartes Labs is a New Mexico startup that uses artificial intelligence technology developed at Los Alamos National Laboratory to provide analysis and predictions based on satellite images of the Earth. Early applications are in delivering crop yield forecasts and analyzing trends in energy, construction, and the environment. Today, the company has its headquarters in Santa Fe and has raised close to $40 million in venture money, employs 70 people, and is a recognized leader in analyzing satellite imagery. We need to help more research turn into innovative startups. Access to capital is key for entrepreneurs. Too many promising young companies fall to the valley of death or get absorbed by behemoths where their innovations stall because they cannot find the financing they need. This is especially tough for innovators in rural and smaller cities. Good ideas and innovations occur everywhere, but more than 3/4 of venture capital goes to companies in San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, and Boston. Expanding access to capital can help us tap into the next generation of innovators creating new startups and new opportunities. Lastly, immigrants are a key source of innovation and entrepreneurship. We cannot jeopardize these enormous contributions through short-sighted immigration policies or by kicking out talented young people. I'm an engineer by training, and I could talk about innovation and R&D and tech transfer all day long, but I look forward to hearing from our witnesses next and hopefully learning some new things along the way.
Thank you, Senator Heinrich, and I will introduce our four witnesses, and then we'll hear from each one of them individually. First, Dr. Harold Furchtgott-Roth is a senior fellow and the founder and director of the Center for the Economics of the Internet at the Hudson Institute. He is the president of Furchtgott-Roth Economic Enterprises, which he founded in 2003. He is an adjunct professor of law at Brooklyn Law School. From 1997 through 2001, Dr. Furchtgott-Roth served as a commissioner of the Federal Communications Commission. Prior to his appointment to the FCC, Dr. Furchtgott-Roth served as chief economist of the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Commerce, where he was one of the principal staff involved in drafting the Telecommunications Act of 1996. Dr. Furchtgott-Roth holds an SB in economics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a PhD in economics from Stanford University. Dr. Michael Strain, who is with us today, is the John G. Searle Scholar and Director of Economic Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. He oversees the Institute's work in economic policy, financial markets, poverty studies, technology policy, energy economics, healthcare policy, and related areas. His research has been published in peer-reviewed academic and policy journals. And before joining AEI, Dr. Strain worked at the U.S. Census Bureau Center for Economic Studies and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York's Macroeconomic Research Group. Dr. Strain holds a PhD in economics from Cornell University. He is a graduate of Marquette University and holds an MA from New York University. Also with us is Mr. Mark Mills, who is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, CEO of the Digital Power Group, faculty fellow at Northwestern's McCormick School of Engineering and Applied Science, and an advisory board member of Notre Dame University's Riley Center for Science, Technology, and Values. Previously, he co-founded and was chief tech strategist of Digital Power Capital. Early in his career, Mills was an experimental physicist and development engineer at Bell Northern Research, Canada's Bell Lab, and he earned several patents for his work. Mills is also a published author and has contributed to the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and Forbes.com. He holds a degree in physics from Queen's University in Ontario, Canada. And then also with us is Dr. Darrell West, who is the Vice President and Director of Governance Studies and holds the Douglas Dillon Chair at the Brookings Institute since 2013. He is the founding director of the Center for Technology Innovation at Brookings and editor-in-chief of Tech Tank. Prior to coming to Brookings, West was the John Hazen White Professor of Political Science and Public Policy and director of the Tubman Center for Public Policy at Brown University. West is the author or co-author of 23 books and has published more than 36 scholarly articles in a wide range of academic journals. He holds an MA and PhD in political science from Indiana University and an AB in political science from Miami University of Ohio. So we have a stellar group of witnesses that are here to share their thoughts and expertise with us today. And with that, we'll begin with you, Dr. Furchtgott-Roth. Thank you for being here, for your opening statement, and I will recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, members of this committee. It's an extraordinary honor for me to testify before you today about economic growth and innovation in America. These are very important topics, and I am going to focus on the information sector, which is the sector I follow most closely. I have prepared testimony, which I hope will be entered into the record. I'm not going to read it all. In fact, I'm going to provide separate comments. My own research shows that a disproportionate share of American economic growth in the past generation is attributable to the information sector. I have 3 simple messages to share with you today. Global economic growth in the past generation has been more profound than any in prior history, and innovation in the information sector was at the core of that growth. The United States played a pivotal role in innovation in the information sector. Important factors included increased protection of property rights, a lighter regulatory approach, and an emphasis on competition. And third, despite early receptivity to the internet, governments in other countries today are threatening the further development of the information sector. The 5 largest corporations in America today by market capitalization are all in the information sector: Amazon, Apple, Google, Facebook, and Microsoft. They are also among the largest corporations in the world. These are all innovative companies, and together with smaller companies in the information sector, all have contributed to innovation and economic growth in America. Countless private companies and startups compete in this sector. Ask a 20-something in America or anywhere around the world where they would like to work, and chances are they're going to say, in a company in the information sector. These new companies have provided the world with new technologies and have captured the imagination of the next generation. Why did these companies develop in the past generation and not before? And why did they develop in the United States and not so much elsewhere? Some might point to extraordinary entrepreneurs and technologists such as Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Steve Jobs, Sergey Brin, Larry Page, and Mark Zuckerberg. Others might emphasize critical technologies developed in past generations that enabled the further development of the information sector. No doubt these and other factors are important, but great entrepreneurs are born in every generation in every country. What made the information sector in the United States over the past generation different? Consider that much of the sector was founded in America. The information sector benefited from 3 conditions that changed in America over the past generation. In America, we established clear property rights in the information sector. We had a determined lighter regulatory approach, and we also, by statute, mandated more competition. Each of these factors was important to the development of the information sector in America over the past generation. Congress changed laws and federal agencies adopted rules that enabled more innovation and economic growth in the information sector. The rest is history. I've also been asked to address why productivity has slowed in recent years. I was asked the same question 40 years ago when I arrived at Stanford University. It became the topic of my dissertation. The answer today is sadly much the same as it was 40 years ago. We know only part, but not all of the reasons. It is much the same across all industrialized countries. One of my professors at Stanford, Moses Abramowitz, once described total factor productivity as a measure of our ignorance. It still is. Having said that, let me briefly note a few major reasons for recent productivity slowdowns. 1, increased share of the economy in the service sector. Output is measured largely as revenue in the service sector, and it's very difficult to measure total factor productivity in those sectors. Second is increased obsolescence of products indicates rapid quality improvements that are not easy to measure. Take a look at your smartphone. There is no market today for an iPhone version 1. It's obsolete. But you can look at a car manufactured in 2009, and there's a good market for it, as there is for a ton of steel. What we have is rapidly improving quality of products that are very, very difficult to measure. Nonetheless, there has been a pronounced decline in total factor productivity in recent years, even in sectors that historically have shown rapid increases in total factor productivity, such as manufacturing, agriculture, mining, and utilities. So, as Professor Abramowitz once said, total factor productivity remains a measure of our ignorance. There are a lot of explanations, but we don't have them all yet. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor. And our next witness we'll hear from is Dr. Strain. Thank you for your opening statement. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. It's an honor to be here. How can Congress foster innovation? What important ways to improve the skills of workers, helping to enable individuals to innovate? Education reforms designed to teach 21st century skills is critical. A stronger emphasis on work-based learning for workers is critical. And in my view, increasing the number of highly skilled immigrants is also critical. Many of the most innovative companies in the United States were founded by immigrants. Government has a role to play in supporting the basic research that innovation requires Two important ways government supports innovation are through funding basic research and through producing economic and social statistics required by businesses, researchers, and policymakers. Beyond encouraging innovation through increasing skills and supporting basic research, there is a wide variety of action government can take, avoiding excessively high tax rates, reducing regulation and other barriers to technological progress, and maintaining a posture of openness to the rest of the world through international trade are just some of the ways public policy can support innovation. Congress can also foster innovation by helping to create and enforce an appropriate regulatory environment. Likewise, imprudent regulation can stifle innovation, slowing economic growth and the rate of improvement of living standards. I've been quite concerned about imprudent regulation recently in the conversation around big tech. It is common to hear calls from both the political left and right to break up major technology firms using the government's antitrust powers. In my view, such action would be a major policy mistake. For the past half-century, the federal government has followed the best standard that experts have crafted to identify anti-competitive behavior: consumer welfare. More specifically, when asking whether a firm is hurting competition, the following question should be asked: is the company reducing the welfare of consumers by pushing up prices that consumers face, and/or by reducing the quality and variety of products and services that consumers enjoy? This antitrust standard stands in contrast to a different view, which rests on the presumption that large and powerful companies should be suspect simply because of their size, under the assumption that with size comes undue economic power and a lack of competition. I would highlight three reasons why the latter view is inferior to the consumer welfare standard. First, it is much more vague and harder to define. This vagueness invites regulatory mischief at worst. More than that, though, is the concern that due to its vagueness, regulators might be swayed more by the public debate around a particular company than by relatively more objective metrics. Second, the view that is suspicious of size ignores the good things that come from size. Economies of scale allow companies to produce goods and services more efficiently and at a lower cost than relatively smaller firms. These efficiencies can take many forms, including more specialized management and production techniques. Third, focusing on size distracts regulatory attention from consumers. This argument is equivalent to asserting that consumer welfare should be the regulatory goal in a normative sense. Big tech has significantly increased consumer welfare. Consider prices. Many products are offered to consumers free of charge. Amazon does not sell its products at a price of zero, but it has significantly reduced the prices faced by consumers for many products to the point that some argue that Amazon may be lowering the rate of consumer price inflation for the overall economy. Now consider product quality and innovation. The services mentioned above are all remarkably innovative. In addition to them, for example, Apple first put an entire music library into the palm of our hands and then put a computer in all of our pockets. Major technology companies spend significant sums of money on research and development for new products in order to foster innovation. Alphabet, the parent company of Google, spends 16% of revenue on research and development. Facebook spends 21%. Microsoft spends 14%. These ratios are far higher than for other companies. For example, General Motors, General Electric, Procter & Gamble, and AT&T each spend less than 5% of revenue on R&D. In addition, there is more churn in the technology industry than many may seem to think. It was not long ago that the dominant web browser was Netscape, not Google, that the dominant email service was not Gmail, and that America Online was the dominant ISP. It is imprudent to assume that Google, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, and other tech giants of today will be dominant in perpetuity. The public conversation also seems to misrepresent the actual dominance of these companies in the present day. For example, despite concern about Amazon's dominance, it is the case that online sales represent less than 10% of total retail sales. Walmart's revenue is more than twice that of Amazon's. In summary, I do not view big tech as a threat to consumer welfare or innovation, and I am not convinced by arguments that antitrust action is required to advance these goals. Instead, big tech is advancing consumer welfare through offering consumers a wide variety of high-quality products at low and sometimes zero prices. It's also advancing consumer welfare and innovation in the future through high amounts of spending on research and development, which will fuel tomorrow's innovation. And that innovation will in turn fuel faster economic growth and higher living standards for American families. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Strain. And now we will welcome Mr. Mills for your opening statement. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Paulsen, and members of the committee. As this committee knows, when it comes to understanding the innovation, how the innovation economy leads to growth, one is necessarily engaged in forecasting technology. And with all due respect to the track record, technology forecasting for Congress, and most pundits and especially economists, with all due respect to my economic colleagues, it's dismal at best. Forecasting could be a dubious science, but it's serious business. My favorite aphorism in this regard dates back to 1963 when physicist and Nobelist Dennis Gabor wrote, "The future cannot be predicted, but it can be invented." Despite recent innovations, there is today a popular forecasting thesis that essentially says we live in a time of a new normal where foundational innovation has run its course. The new normalists don't propose that there's an end to the kind of technology disruptions we're witnessing now with social media and the Internet's impact on politics and culture. Instead, they claim innovation is now a kind of froth on top of a paradigm of sort of permanently slower economic growth because nothing really fundamental is happening in innovation. The new normalists misinterpret, though, the record of recent slow growth. What we've been living through, in fact, is an interregnum between great technological cycles. History offers a lot of examples of this phenomenon, but permit me to illustrate just one recent example in energy domains where technology forecasting offers specific lessons also for manufacturing and healthcare. When the Department of Energy was created 41 years ago, nearly every forecaster said, to use economic terms, hydrocarbon technology productivity had stalled out. It would not be able to affordably supply energy at the scale society would need in the future. Policymaking then sort of focused on a kind of palliative care for hydrocarbons, banning exports, constraining consumption, creating strategic reserves. And over the decades, a cumulative $500 billion was spent by the federal government in the pursuit of technologies that were forecast to be essential to replace hydrocarbons. We now know what happened. Engineers in the private sector invented a new technology that unlocked America's vast shale fields that turned out to be astonishingly productive. Shale tech has added 2,000% more energy to the United States over the past decade alone than have solar and wind combined. But those on the front lines of the shale revolution and the few forecasters who did anticipate what would actually happen were at that time generally ignored, or they were viewed as engaged in old think or in the pockets of entrenched industries. As some in this committee know, my written record shows that I was counted amongst those in the history's minority. There are at least a couple of lessons from energy's history that are relevant. Noisy public debate and aspirational forecasts can hide the real underlying trends, and what appears to be innovation stalling out is often a pause, the interregnum between eras as engineers and industries perfect and adopt new technologies. The question today is, what signals are we missing hidden in the media noise about the demise of manufacturing and the claimed inevitability of cripplingly higher healthcare costs? In my submitted testimony for the record, I've addressed both those, but in my brief oral remarks, I'll highlight healthcare. There's a lot of excitement these days about information systems applied to healthcare, the rising power of algorithms and machine learning. In fact, we're likely seeing a new battle for healthcare efficiency launched by the announced collaboration between Amazon, Berkshire Hathaway, and J.P. Morgan. But information systems will add valuable efficiency to administering existing healthcare services and the management of records and insurance. But doing better with existing data and therapeutics isn't enough for a real revolution in healthcare productivity. Information systems inherently depend on acquiring more and better information. One has to have a physical means to act on that information as well. Fortunately, we're on the cusp of a technological revolution in biological data acquisition and diagnostics and therapeutics. A lot of attention has been afforded to the promise of genetic engineering, itself information-centric. But the other two domains are equally critical, diagnostic tools and information acquisition. There's now a clear path to commercial bioelectronics that are body-compatible, implantable, even digestible. And bioelectronics will ultimately rival and scale the traditional silicon electronics industry and create a tsunami of heretofore unavailable health-centric data. Much of that data will end up being channeled through radically new kinds of diagnostic tools, many soon in the hands of consumers, not just professionals. There are far-reaching implications with the prospect of nearly every citizen possessing a useful diagnostic device. Apple, for example, is well aware of the fact that features inherent in or can be added to an iPhone constitute implicit, if not explicit, classification as a medical device. Last year's X Prize, awarded for a portable diagnostic tool, was a dramatic example of that kinds of devices that were once just the stuff of science fiction. That prize was awarded for inventing the Star Trek tricorder. For those who are not science fiction cognoscenti, that spaceship's doctor would wave a handheld tricorder over a patient to obtain immediate diagnosis. The real-world X Prize was for a mobile device that was able to diagnose 13 health conditions and continuously monitor 5 vital health signs. All of this says nothing about the revolutionary healthcare technologies emerging from a class of practical robots and so-called cobots, the latter working collaboratively with people. These will unlock not only more hyper-precise and minimally invasive surgery, but also radically more productive tools for elder care and rehabilitation. For the record, the same trifecta of technologies, computing, new materials, and new machines, is signaling a manufacturing productivity revolution as well. History shows that economy-moving revolutions in technology have never been predicted by economists. Instead, they've been invented and propelled, usually unexpectedly, by innovators. If there's a central lesson for policymaking, it's that instead of directing innovation, it's critical to ensure that there's an environment that doesn't impede innovators. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mills. And now we'll hear from Dr. West. You're recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Chairman Paulsen, Ranking Member Heinrich, and members of the Joint Economic Committee. So thank you for the opportunity to testify at this hearing. So today I want to summarize my thinking on the innovation economy. My latest book is entitled The Future of Work, Robots, AI, and Automation, and it looks at the impact of new technologies on the workforce, education, and public policy. I also have a new paper co-authored with Brookings President John Allen on how artificial intelligence is transforming the world. Based on this research, it is clear that the federal government plays a vital role in encouraging innovation. I think there are several steps that would increase our economic growth and make sure the United States does not fall behind other leading nations. First, I argue we need to increase federal R&D. Right now, the U.S. spends about $495 billion on R&D, with 72% of that money coming from the business sector and only 11% coming from the federal government. If you go back to the 1960s, the federal government provided 65% of R&D, and we saw NASA land man on the moon. In 1969, we planted the seeds for today's internet through a Department of Defense communications tool called ARPANET. So we need to remember that historically the federal government has played a vital role in these advances, and we have done very well on innovation. I think there is a danger of relying too much on the private sector for 3/4 of R&D because of its vulnerability to macroeconomic cycles. When the economy weakens, companies often slash their R&D, and important strategic priorities can be lost through the decisions of individual firms. Secondly, we need to maintain our international competitiveness. The United States now devotes about 2.74% of GDP to research and development. This is less than the 4.23% devoted by South Korea, 3.29% in Japan, and 2.93% in Germany. Now, China only devotes about 2%, but it has been increasing its R&D spending by anywhere from 14 to 20% every year since 2000. In fact, China accounts for 31% of the world's R&D increase during this 15-year time period. Third, we need to address our critical needs in AI and data analytics. The U.S. government is spending only about $1.1 billion a year on non-classified AI. And just to contrast this, at its 19th Party Congress, China announced it was going to spend $150 billion on AI and plans to become the global leader by 2030. As John Allen and I argue in our recent paper, AI is the transformative technology of our era, and it is going to dictate our leadership in terms of national security, economic development, and resource management, including many other areas. Fourth, we need to promote STEM education. There are too few Americans studying science, technology, engineering, and math. Only 17% of Americans earn a STEM bachelor's degree, of those who are graduating from college, and 65% of them are male. This is far less than other nations. For example, in Korea, 38% are graduating with STEM degrees. China is producing 4.7 million STEM graduates every year, compared to about 500,000 in the United States. So we need to hire more science and math teachers in K-12. We need to pay those teachers higher salaries. Fifth, we need to invest in our physical and digital infrastructure. We still have many Americans who lack access to the internet. We are moving to 5G networks. They're going to be faster, smarter, and more efficient, but they're going to require the deployment of small cell towers. We need to streamline the local approvals for those towers. Six, we need to improve data access. Data analytics has tremendous potential to transform both public and private sector decision-making. It will give us new insights into healthcare, energy efficiency, and national security. The last point I want to make is just the need to improve our digital access. It is crucial that everyone shares in the benefits of our innovation economy. We currently have disparities by income, race, and education. There are major gaps for rural Americans, which I can appreciate having grown up on a dairy farm in rural Ohio. 1/3 of rural dwellers lack access to high-speed internet, so this limits their ability to participate in the innovation economy, so it's vital that we close that digital divide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. West. And now we'll have an opportunity to ask questions and have an answer period. Ask members and remind them to keep your question period to 5 minutes. I'll begin. Dr. Furchtgott-Roth, the importance of technological progress in driving economic growth is widely agreed upon by members on both sides of the aisle. However, there is some disagreement about how much growth is actually left to be had and how to encourage the necessary innovation that fuels technological progress. Do you think there will be much stronger growth moving forward? And if so, why?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that question. I don't remember the author of this statement, but approximately 120 years ago, someone famous said that we had reached the end of science and all discoveries that were important had been made, and there really wasn't much point in pursuing it any further. I think that any suggestion that innovation has reached an end, any suggestion that we are at the end of technology is naive and misguided. I think there's an awful lot still going on.
Okay. And Dr. Strain, maybe you can provide some thoughts. Dr. West had just mentioned about how AI is sort of the transformational initiative that we'll be looking at in the future here. And sometimes we have a little bit of disagreement in terms of sort of how much resources that the federal government should do in just basic research versus really encouraging more government spending, especially on R&D and other programs to help invest in innovation and fuel growth. And, what is sort of the reasonable approach? Sort of the basic foundations of research versus, a lot more government spending in research and development, and how do you draw those distinctions and those lines?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's an excellent question. I think there's a clear role, in my view, for the federal government to provide resources to universities and to scientists and to centers that fuel innovation for some kind of clear economic reasons. Those types of innovative activities generate public goods. Those public goods would be underprovided if it were left to the private market, and so there's a clear economic rationale for federal funding there. I think it's important that those resources be well targeted because it's taxpayer money after all, and making sure that laws are written and that agencies like the National Science Foundation are distributing money in such a way that the projects are selected carefully to encourage economic growth and to fuel innovation, I think is very important. I also think it's important that Congress ensure that the basic economic and social statistics infrastructure remains strong. That's important for policymaking. It's important for private business activity, both of which have downstream effects on innovation and on economic growth as well. An immediate issue is the 2020 census. That's far afield from this hearing, but it's something that is on my mind when your question was asked.
So you're sort of referring also to the fact that modern technology isn't often fully captured in existing measures right now with GDP and different areas of, productivity measures. Is there a way to, what are your thoughts on sort of capturing those statistics or data to make sure we're making smart policy decisions?
Well, I think it's an extremely difficult challenge for the reason that my colleague mentioned. It's hard to kind of compare the price of an iPhone 1 in the year 2018 to an iPhone 1 in the year 2009. The people who work on these issues over at the Bureau of Labor Statistics and throughout the federal statistical system are very capable people who are doing a good job with what they have, and I think making that sort of measurement issue a priority for them would be a way to move the ball forward there.
Mr. Mills, just in the final minute, but you mentioned the future can't be predicted, but it can be invented. Do you have some other thoughts?
Well, I do. In fact, one of the themes that we're hearing is this challenge of thinking about where is the role of government, and I'm extremely enthusiastic about the proposition that government should spend more money on basic research. However, I think we have a definitional problem between what is basic research and science and what are projects. So putting a man on the moon is engineering. It's not basic research. It's not science. We do learn science along the way, but it's an engineering project. I worked as both an engineer and a scientist. I admire both domains. Often never the twain shall meet, and I would like them not to meet so much in the government domains. Other than for Apollo programs and aircraft carriers, I think the government should focus on basic science. If you look at the history of the sort of disquisitions that come from Nobel laureates, what you'll find the common thread in their awards is that they had done research that was driven by curiosity. In fact, they used those words, that these great discoveries that advance humanity didn't come from directed research, but they were allowed to do research that was driven by curiosity. Tough thing to fund, I understand, but I think it's where the government has a critical role.
Thank you. All right. Ranking Member Heinrich, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll start with a comment, Mr. Mills, because I think that they should actually meet more. You look at a national laboratory like Sandia, and one of the keys to their success is the cross-pollination that occurs there between basic science and engineering. And that actually played a key role in the development of the hydraulic fracturing that you referenced in your testimony. I think it is that cross-pollination that we oftentimes fund things in silos in government and don't have the full benefit of their leverage. Dr. Strain, I want to jump to you because you talked a lot about some of the big information sectors. You talked about Amazon in particular. I don't hear a lot about Amazon's low prices from my constituents, and that's not a critique of Amazon, but I do hear a lot about them on its impact to small Main Street businesses in rural areas. And the point of raising that is that the benefits of innovation, especially on a gross level, a GDP level, are pretty easy to quantify, but they also have very real negative impacts to specific populations. And those benefits are not flowing equally or homogeneously across our country. So how do we make sure, while supporting innovation, that innovation's benefits don't just accrue to urban and coastal communities?
Well, thank you, Senator, for the question, and it's a very important one for sure. I think it is the case that most people who live even in rural communities, even in communities where kind of local mom and pop stores are threatened by Amazon, still benefit from innovation and still benefit from technology companies and benefit specifically from Amazon. The reason that those mom and pop stores are threatened is because Amazon is charging lower prices than the mom and pop stores can, and that people in those communities are not going to the mom and pop store anymore because they're purchasing their goods elsewhere.
But most of them, my point is, would not choose, a quarter or $1 off their box of soap that gets delivered to their house if they have to trade that for their neighbor down the street no longer being able to keep a retail shop open. How do we get the benefits of that innovation into those communities so that there's a vested reason for them to want to be part of the innovation economy?
Yeah, so it's a classic example of somewhat diffused benefits and concentrated costs. So there are some people who are really bearing the brunt of this sort of change, and then many people who are benefiting from it. But the people who are bearing the brunt of it, that weighs heavier on them, and there are a fewer number of them. It's a classic example of the kind of creative destruction that's a hallmark of a market economy. I think the wrong solution is to try and stop innovation, and the wrong solution is to try and tax companies that.
So let's get to the right solution. I'm running out of time.
Well, the right solution is harder. I think what we need is to have a kind of a robust set of policies designed to create on-ramps to opportunity for people who are negatively impacted by technology. And that's why I mentioned in my testimony things like work-based learning and similar programs.
Dr. West, do you have a thought on this?
The right way to maintain innovation that we all value is to keep the startup economy that has been crucial to the tech sector and the greatness of America. And here I have one major concern. We've been compiling data for 40 years on the number of startups in America. Yep. In the last decade, there's been a dramatic drop in the number of startups. If you look at the period from 1970 to the mid-2000s, America averaged between 500,000 and 600,000 startups. Now we're down to 450,000. So keeping that emphasis on competition, helping small businesses start off is absolutely crucial.
Let me ask you about something that specifically impacts small businesses. Yesterday I met with recently departed FCC Commissioner Mignon Clyburn, and she emphasized ensuring that all Americans have access to a free and open internet, and how important that is to foster innovation in places where it's particularly hard. What about the digital divide? You've talked about that. And what about a free internet? Does net neutrality promote or stifle innovation? Dr. West.
In terms of the digital divide, as I believe you pointed out in your opening statement, there are 19 million Americans in rural areas that do not have access to broadband. 1/3 of people who live in rural areas lack access to high-speed broadband. If you want to apply for a job today, many companies, and Brookings has done the same thing, has converted to online applications. You have to have access to the digital economy in order to get a job. In terms of the open internet, it is important to maintain the open internet. One of the reasons why our country has done so well on innovation over the last couple of decades has been that we treat all internet traffic the same. There's been no discrimination in the traffic. You can't slow down anyone's traffic. If you're the small guy operating a small convenience store on the corner, your traffic gets treated the same as the large company. So it's important to maintain that.
Thank you. Now we'll listen to the Vice Chairman of the committee. Senator Lee, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to each of you for coming. Your expertise brings a lot to our committee. The FAA has banned the commercial flight of supersonic aircraft in this country. This ban was found in a regulation that was promulgated back in 1973, so some 45 years ago. And today, in 2018, commercial aircraft travel no faster than they did 50 years ago, in part as a result of this. And significantly, the Concorde, the heavy, clunky, supersonic commercial aircraft that was in use at the time the regulation was promulgated, has been grounded today, in part as a result of those regulations. But when we look at this today, we realize that there are some companies that have developed technologies using stronger, lighter materials that could achieve a greater degree of fuel efficiency. And perhaps most importantly, there are some companies that have developed technologies that they claim can result in commercial-grade supersonic travel that is 30 times quieter than the Concorde was. And this seems like an example of the problem we face when regulations don't keep pace with current technology. And so, Dr. West, I'd like to ask you a question about this. What do you think some of the benefits to the United States might be from supersonic travel? And is this something that, that you think we ought to continue to stick to? Is it time for Congress to revisit this idea of banning overland supersonic commercial travel?
I think there's been so much innovation over the last 40 years that any regulation from 40 years ago deserves another look, because I remember when the Concorde was flying, there was concern at the time about sonic booms, and that was annoying people on the ground, and so that was one of the reasons that created a complication there. But I would not be surprised if the manufacturers have figured out ways to handle that, that there are noise abatement procedures that would make a difference. So we certainly need to constantly take a look at regulations. We need to move into what I would call smart regulation, which basically is well-designed and focuses on specific problems.
And just because I find this area interesting, I would note in response to your observation, it is my understanding that the sonic boom is somewhat analogous to the wake that travels behind a boat or a ship. And just as the size and the shape and the materials used in a boat or a ship can affect the type of wake it casts, there are ways of diminishing the impact of the sonic boom, and that's yet another reason why we ought to revisit this nearly half-century-old regulation that is really out of date. In the coming years, we're going to see the deployment of 5G technology. 5G wireless networks are going to revolutionize all sorts of things, but they require the deployment of a large number of small antenna systems, somewhat different from our current cell phone networks. The dawn of the 5G era brings a whole lot of opportunities in the way we will travel, in the offering of things like telemedicine, in the travel of autonomous vehicles, both on the land and in the air, in drone use, and in greater connectivity generally. Dr. Furchtgott-Roth, I'd like to ask you, these benefits can be impeded by government regulations that could stop the deployment of this technology. Is our current regulatory framework prepared to handle these challenges, the challenges associated with the deployment of a 5G network?
Senator, it's a very good question. A lot of people are very concerned about the deployment of 5G technologies, and in fact are concerned about whether regulation will get in the way. I think at the federal level, and I would say even at the state level, that most people in government are trying to take great efforts to be sure that there are not impediments to the deployment of the new technologies. There are a handful of municipalities around the country that want to create new regulations on the siting of towers, or in the case of 5G networks, it's not going to be towers, it's just going to be a tiny little box that can stick on the side of a building. And so I think there's some concern that municipalities may be impeding the deployment. We'll have to see.
Okay, thank you. I see my time's expired, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Peters, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses today. Appreciate the conversation. It's been very interesting. I'm concerned about the growth of innovation that we see in this economy for other sectors outside of IT and healthcare, which of course are big drivers for the economy right now, but look at it more broadly, coming from Michigan, particularly with a lot of older industries there. And a recent Economic Innovation Group study, I was struck by a finding that they cite, another study that shows that in the United States today only generates 2 non-health and non-IT patents for every $1 billion in GDP. So taking out IT, taking out healthcare, looking at a decline of dynamism generally in the rest of the economy, which is a very large part of our economy. And in the 1980s, it was 4. So basically, it's half. The innovation outside of IT and healthcare has, at least as measured by the number of patents, which is just one of other many measures you could have, has dropped in half. Dr. Furchtgott-Roth, any ideas? You've certainly talked in your testimony. We have a lot of explanations for what's happening in productivity, and you mentioned the iPhone example, but that would be out of this. This is innovation within these other industries.
Thank you, Senator. It's a very important question. If I had my econometrics hat on, I would say there's an inflation issue. If you're comparing patents per dollar of activity in 1980s with today, you're going to have It's not surprising to see some decline per dollar. But I think the real question you're asking is really far more profound than that, which is outside of some sectors of the economy, probably particularly high-tech, healthcare, the United States no longer has the global position that it had a generation ago. I think that's very troubling, and it's something that I hope this committee will be able to address, to figure out. I focus a lot on the information sector. That's an area where the United States has a very strong global position. There are other industries where we have lost that edge, and I'm very troubled about actions that are being taken by other governments that threaten the information sector and no doubt other sectors of the economy.
I appreciate that. We need to work more on this because this is a fundamental question for us to deal with. And I think part of what folks have talked about, at least in my reading, and it's correlated, I think, to what Dr. West talked about, is the decline of new business formation, because it's a lot of those smaller businesses and particularly these other industries where you can get more innovation as a result of that. Dr. West, you've talked about the decline of that. One other statistic that I've been looking at and would love to have your comments, and this doesn't refute, but maybe a little counter to what Dr. Strain said, but is that we have seen just a concentration in our economy with larger and larger firms across the sectors. In fact, I think one of the statistics are, if you look at over the last 20 years, we have more concentration now in more industries than we've had in the past. And as you have bigger and bigger firms, it becomes more difficult for a small firm to start in those industries. Dr. Strain mentioned the advantages of size, which there are significant ones, including economies of scale, et cetera. What do you believe, where's the academic literature, that because of increasing concentration across all industries, that we've actually seen a decline in dynamism in the economy as a result of that and the competitive advantage that big firms have?
I do worry about small businesses getting squeezed out of this environment. I think the competition is an issue, and we need to take a look at it. In 2014, in the Wall Street Journal, Silicon Valley entrepreneur Peter Thiel wrote a famous column saying competition is for losers and argued that monopolies are great. I strongly disagree with that viewpoint. I think small businesses actually create a lot of the jobs. When we think back to the big tech sector, most of those firms started in garages or dorm rooms, so it's really vital that we maintain an environment where small businesses can thrive.
And in the remaining time, I only have 30 seconds. It's a big question for you, but you mentioned AI and the transformative nature of AI. It's also been argued, and I agree that it's transformative, but it's large capitalized companies, big companies that will be able to use AI more efficiently and more effectively than smaller companies and could actually further concentration. Is that a potential problem?
It's a potential problem, but the economic payoff of AI is just so substantial. PricewaterhouseCoopers just put out a study in which they estimated AI can increase global GDP by over $15 trillion. Unfortunately, half of that money is going to go to China just because they're investing and they're really putting a lot of effort into there. Only about 20% of that is going to accrue to North America. So that's an area where we need to do better.
Thank you.
Representative Handel, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you to each of the witnesses. Mr. Mills, I saw you shaking your head a little bit about the comment that AI is going to primarily benefit larger companies. Would you like to tell me what you think about that?
Yeah, I don't think that's what's going to happen, but we're back in the forecasting game here. AI is in early days of deployment. In fact, the AI community is struggling with the same kind of reproducibility challenges that the medical community and the science community at large has in terms of claims. But more interesting is that I think will happen is that AI is going to democratize the nature of computing and will actually help small businesses. So we're at an odd phase in the computing infrastructure of the world. So you have the big guys competing to create these broad cloud, infrastructures of access to cheap computing. There's fierce competition among a half dozen major players, another half dozen very significant players. There will be some winners, but I don't think the consolidation is going to happen very quickly. And what they're doing is providing astoundingly cheap, essentially free, and for small businesses, actually free supercomputing in the cloud running AI. So I'm a partner in a boutique venture fund that invests not on the coasts. We invest in the heartland in software. And one of our companies is an AI company that does AI primarily for the resource industries and oil and gas. But they get, and they're proud of this, AWS compute power for free. Amazon offers startup companies. Now, it's a hook. They want them to stay in when they become bigger. But that hook is chasing a rapidly declining cost of AI. It means that the supply chain advantages Amazon had in the early days get democratized to the mom and pop shops. I'm frankly worried about regulating big tech like Dr. Strain is, but I'm particularly enthusiastic about the democratizing effect of what will become a sort of an era of embodied computing universally.
Well, it's interesting. I just coincidentally had a meeting with a young fellow, literally a very young fellow in his early 20s, who is an extraordinary innovator and inventor in the AI sector, and he has a very small company, and he has been able to monetize it, and he's doing extremely well as a 23-year-old. So what he said to me, and this goes to my next question for you, Dr. Strain, he said that he sees AI and this breakthrough as, while some would be concerned that it's going to take jobs away from Americans, he rather sees it as a way to help individuals do their jobs better. And as we've seen technology advances come forward, we always hear the cry that, oh, it's going to be the demise of the worker and the workplace, but we've really not seen that come forward. Do you have some thoughts, Dr. Strain, on that?
I do, and it's such an important question. My answer will be somewhat similar to my answer to Senator Heinrich. This will be a situation where you have concentrated costs and diffuse benefits. So there will be some people who are impacted quite negatively, but the technology will accrue overall to the benefit of everybody, and it will accrue to the benefit of the average American, if you will. There have been many periods of history, both in the United States and in Europe, where new technologies have kind of come to the fore, and there have been concern that those technologies would make human work obsolete. Those concerns have never come to pass. In my view, we are not looking at a situation where those concerns will come to pass at any point in the near future as well. New kinds of work will be created.
Great, thank you. And in my remaining time for Dr. Furchtgott-Roth, you made a comment that in your opinion, the United States has lost its edge when it comes to innovation and discovery. Why do you think that, and what can we do from a policy, put the money investment part aside, but policy framework can we do to help regain our place in the innovation hierarchy?
Well, as I mentioned in my comments, I think there are three elements. One is clear property rights. The second is a lighter regulatory touch. And the third is competition. I think all three of these are important and necessary for innovation. And my comment was in response to Senator Peters about certain sectors of the economy where we used to be globally dominant and no longer are.
All right, thank you, and I'm running out of time. I yield back.
Representative Adams, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your testimony, gentlemen. In 2017, the National Institutes of Health, the primary government agency for biomedical and public health research, spent $19 billion on research grants. These grants funded thousands of laboratories across the country. And since the majority of this work is done by academic researchers, these grants are an important source of federal funds for universities and their surrounding communities. In short, research funding translates into greater economic opportunity for the researchers, their schools, and the communities hosting them. So perhaps you can imagine my concern at finding out that of the top 100 organizations that NIH gives research funding to, no HBCU, historically black college or university, is included. Not one was on the list. So Dr. West, what are the implications for HBCUs being left out of the bulk of NIH funding?
Well, I'd say it's devastating for them, and it's devastating for their local economies, because we know, as you suggest, R&D really drives economic development. In fact, people have suggested the multiplier effect is, 5 to 1 or 10 to 1. I mean, it's a huge economic effect. In many local communities, economic development is based on eds and meds. It's the education sector and the biomedical sector and the hospital sector that drives a lot of economic growth. So if the HBCUs are not getting the grants, it's really going to limit what they can do research-wise, but also have a devastating impact on their local communities.
So what about the, what implications do you find of the funding disparity for the students that these universities teach?
It means that they will be denied opportunities, especially in the STEM fields and in biomedical areas, and those are going to be the growth areas in the future. So if they're coming out of college and they don't have those skills, it's going to limit their opportunities. We know that by 2044, America is going to become a majority-minority country, and so it's crucial that we recruit more women into the STEM field, but also more minorities so that that sector represents the full diversity of America.
Thank you. The topic today is how innovation helps the economy grow. And I'm really on HBCUs because not only did I attend one and spent 40 years on the campus, I really know the impact that these colleges and universities have, not only on our economy, but also on our students. So if HBCUs and other minority-serving institutions continue to be underfunded in regards to federal research grants, can the economy grow equally? Dr. West, that's a question for you.
Well, the short answer is no. And one of the concerns that I have is if you look at the venture capital money today, 3/4 of it is basically concentrated on the coasts. And so most of America is being left out of the growth areas of the economy. Something like 2/3 of GDP is now taking place in less than 1/3 of America. Those geographic inequities are devastating. It makes most of the country feel left behind while the coasts are running ahead and doing very well. It's bad for our country, and it has a devastating effect on our politics.
So can the African-American community expect to see the same economic impact from government research grants if HBCUs are not receiving proportional federal funding that the PWIs, or the predominantly white institutions, receive?
There deserves to be greater representation there, both from a fairness standpoint, but also from an economic development standpoint. Many of those schools are located in places that are not doing that well economically, and so this is one way in which the federal government can play a constructive role of helping communities that have been left behind by technology innovation and making sure that they're able to compete in the years going forward.
Well, thank you for your responses. You know, when you look at across the country, we've got 106 or more of these schools, and it would really, I think, be important not only to them, to the students that attend them, but also to our economy for us to take another look there. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative LaHood. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for being here today and for your valuable testimony. I know we've touched a little bit on competition here today, and when I think of the tech or the titan firms that are out there, obviously some of them have been under scrutiny for what some would deem as somewhat sophisticated or calculated and arguably anti-competitive practices. For instance, a number of these tech companies have combined their ability to collect data and build algorithms to determine which products or services are trending. And once they have achieved those results, these same companies then can alter their search engines to favor their own products and services over their competitors, and even simply buy out their competitors. And you add these companies' significant network effects where value is added to the company simply because a consumer chooses to use only that company's products or services. These firms gain significant market power, and I think we've seen that in a lot of different instances. I guess from a public policy standpoint, when we think about what government can or can't do, how do we ensure that startups, which are the major drivers of innovation, are still able to compete and be able to have a market to innovate as a whole? And I think I'll start with Dr. West.
Thank you. I agree with your emphasis on competition. I agree that there's a problem in terms of the decline of startups in America. My colleague Bill Galston and Clara Hendrickson wrote a paper on this topic, which I would recommend to everyone on the committee. And what they suggest is the need to update our merger review guidelines for the digital economy. Many of those guidelines date back 20 and 30 years, have not really been updated, even though our economy has undergone major changes. So we need to kind of look at how we think about those types of things.
Dr. Strain?
I certainly think this is an extremely important issue, and I agree with Dr. West that looking at some of the merger rules is a reasonable course of action. I think it's important to recognize that there's more complexity here than there may seem. So, on the one hand, it is the case that that tech giants are buying smaller tech firms and kind of folding them in to their conglomerate, and it is reasonable to speculate that may be reducing innovation and reducing competition in the economy. The flip side might also be the case. It could be that the opportunity to be purchased by a major tech firm is actually something that's incentivizing people to innovate and to create new tech companies. Their goal could be to be purchased. And so it's an area that I think merits further study and further examination, but it's not immediately clear to me that because Facebook purchased Instagram, there's less competition and innovation than there otherwise would be.
Along those same lines, as we look at the Federal Trade Commission and their role that they play, does the FTC have a modernized set of tests and evaluations to adequately determine if and when a tech company is stifling competition or innovation or is anti-competitive? Do you feel that their standards and evaluations are currently up to par on that? You want to comment on that, Dr. Strain?
Yes, I feel that the standards are the right standards. The standards focus on the consumer and on the welfare of the consumer. The standards focus on the prices that consumers face, on the quality and variety of products that are offered to consumers, and on whether innovation is being fostered and whether competition is being advanced. There are other standards, and other countries place emphasis on different things, but that standard has been the standard in the United States for the past half century, and it still seems to me to be the correct and appropriate standard.
Thanks. Mr. Mills, my ears perked up when you mentioned the Heartland. I represent a district in central Illinois. Peoria, Illinois is my hometown, and you talked about investment in the Heartland when it comes to not necessarily the East or the West Coast. How do we look at smaller markets, and what is the attraction to investing in tech in medium-sized markets or the Heartland?
Well, the short answer is, if you're to be mildly cynical, is that the pricing of the deals is better. So you're not competing against large venture funds that add a zero to the valuation of a company you want to invest in. So you can find just as smart young men and women and older men and women. I would note the Kaufman Index shows that the number of startups started by people over 55 is the same as the number under 35 as a percentage of startups. It's attractive because there's a lot going on, but it's not attractive if you don't like traveling. So venture funds tend to like to invest in their geographical orbit. I would like to point out that one of the big problems is, having been a practicing venture capitalist and began one, and having taken a company through an IPO as the founding chairman and CTO, that the biggest problem that we have in getting new companies to not be bought by an Amazon, to be bought by a GM or whoever, is that we've damaged the IPO process. The finance regulatory system makes it extraordinarily difficult and extraordinarily expensive. And this has been well analyzed by a lot of academics. As a practitioner being run through that mill, I can tell you it's a very difficult, very painful process. I know what it's designed to do is to protect innocent victims buying stock in companies that are, charlatans, but it is. I think the pendulum has swung too far.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Maloney. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank you and the ranking member for calling this incredibly important hearing, and all of our panelists. I believe this is certainly one issue that we can firmly all agree on, that innovation and entrepreneurial drive is one of the defining characteristics, if not the defining characteristic, of America's success. And certainly it has been essential to our economic success. And I'm disturbed by some of your statements that we are losing our competitive edge and our really innovative success in this area. I just have noticed economically in my own district and around the country that retail stores are closing. They're just closing in droves. You have empty stores, and I represent Manhattan. It's a business district, but stores, particularly retail stores, are all going out of business. I read an article last week that 18 major retail companies are going out of business, and I resisted buying online, but now I do everything online because it's faster and I don't have time to go shopping. But there are no more toy stores, clothing stores. They're all going under, and that's just one example of how a large conglomerate, in this case Amazon, is taking over. And it just is common sense that when these large conglomerates go in and dominate, they're going to stifle the creativity in those areas and the competition in those areas. But I want to ask Dr. Furchtgott, in your testimony you state the need for strong intellectual property laws, and I agree that our property laws have brought many people to invest in our country. They trust our laws, they invest in our countries. But in the past, the high-tech industry has benefited greatly from the fact that workers often move from one company to another, taking their skills with them. It's been argued that this cross-cultural or hybridization has been a significant factor in promoting innovation. If you look at the automobile, as companies all came up in Detroit, the Silicon Valley, all these high-tech companies are out there. And now we see a trend where some companies have tried to enforce non-disclosure agreements that restrict the movement of skilled workers or take a broad interpretation of what knowledge is proprietary. They're being forced to sign non-compete, won't go to another firm, won't share information. Yet if you look at the history of the country, it was this cross ideas that people would get in an area and talk to each other, go to another firm, do a startup. But now with these non-competes and this, that, and the other, I'd just like to think, what kind of impact do you think these agreements have, and are they damaging innovation? I'd like to ask you, and I'd like to ask Dr. West about the impact of these non-disclosure, non-compete, won't go to another firm, you can't go to another firm in the same industry, that these industry, high-tech firms and others are forcing their employees to sign. I even went to visit a high-tech firm. I was just visiting it, and I was going in and touring it, and I had to sign a non-disclosure, will not reveal anything I learned during the trip that I had to just look at it. So what is this going to have on? It's a true story. I couldn't believe it. But this is, anyway, to the panelists. If you start, Dr.
Yes, thank you. It's a very important question. I think a lot of the non-compete contracts are very fact-specific, and I'm sure there's some that are very problematic and may have discouraging effects on innovation, and others may very well be necessary for companies to be willing to invest in employees and be willing to share information with them. So I'd be very, I'm not in a position to make a blanket statement about their effectiveness. Maybe some of the other panelists have a stronger view.
Okay. Dr. West, do you have a?
Yes, I do have stronger views on that, so thank you for the opportunity. I agree with you that many of the non-compete clauses are overly broad. I mean, I grew up in an era where most employees were free agents, and you basically sold your talent to the highest bidder, or where you wanted to work. I think we have gotten away from that, and I think that damages our ability to innovate. It damages competition, and it's probably part of this drop in startups that we've been seeing over the last 40 years.
Mm-hmm. I have 1 minute left, but I'm going to ask, I guess it was Dr. Strain, you said that, that all of these huge conglomerates were not hindering, if I heard you correctly, you know, the competition, and it was really still a small part of the profit or the organizations. But I got to tell you, I don't remember an antitrust suit in my lifetime, and yet you read the history of our country, and there was one antitrust suit after another trying to break up monopolies. I guess we did have one when we reformed the telecommunications system in America and said AT&T could no longer dominate everything, but there would be competition. And I would argue that's what brought us all of the new internet and high-tech firms, is when we deregulated that, we had a burst of activity where a young, brilliant kid could start their own company. But we're fixing it so that it's becoming harder to happen. So I just want to throw that out. I'm concerned about the domination. And I read an article that one major company begins every meeting by saying, dominate. We must dominate America's commerce. We must dominate the world in this area. And I don't see that dominating brought us the innovation that brought us the success that we have as a country. And if we lose that success, I think we lose a fundamental element of what America is. I'm very concerned about it. Thank you for calling this hearing, my two vice chair and chair. I think it's very important.
Thank you. And let me just thank all of our witnesses for taking the time to appear before the committee today. And I want to remind members, should they wish to submit additional questions for the record, the hearing record will be open for 5 business days. And with that, our committee is adjourned.